In the year 551 before the Common Era, in the small state of Lu on the eastern plains of ancient China, a child was born who would transform the moral and philosophical landscape of East Asia for over 2 millennia. His birth name was Kong Qiu, though he would later be known by the honorific Confucius, meaning Master Kong, which Western scholars would eventually render as Confucius. The world into which he emerged was one of extraordinary turmoil and transformation, a period when the ancient certainties of Chinese civilization seemed to be crumbling into dust, and when new ways of thinking about human society, governance, and ethics were desperately needed. The China of Confucius's birth was nothing like the unified empire it would later become. Instead, it was a patchwork of competing states, each vying for supremacy in the wake of the Zhou dynasty's collapse. This era, known as the Spring and Autumn period, took its name from the chronicle of the state of Lu, the Spring and Autumn Annals, which recorded events year by year with meticulous attention to the changing seasons. The period had begun in 770 before the Common Era, when barbarian tribes called the Quanrong attacked the Zhou capital and forced the royal house to flee eastward to Luoyang. From that moment forward, the Zhou kings retained only nominal authority, their power reduced to little more than ceremonial functions, while regional lords carved up the territories that had once been united under a single throne. The state of Lu, where Confucius was born, occupied what is now Shandong province in northeastern China. It was a relatively small state, neither the most powerful nor the most populous of the competing principalities, but it held a special place in Chinese tradition. Lu was said to have been founded by the Duke of Zhou, a legendary sage ruler from the early days of the Zhou dynasty, who had served as regent to the young King Chong and who had willingly relinquished power once the king came of age. This act of voluntary submission, of placing the good of the realm above personal ambition, would become a cornerstone of Confucian political philosophy. The Duke of Zhou represented an ideal of virtuous governance that Confucius would spend his entire life trying to revive in an age that seemed to have forgotten such noble principles. The traditional accounts of Confucius's family background suggest that he came from aristocratic stock, descended from a branch of the royal house of Shang, the dynasty that had ruled China before the Zhou conquest. His family name, Kong, indicated that his ancestors had once held positions of importance, perhaps as nobles or high officials. However, by the time of Confucius's birth, the fortunes of the Kong family had declined considerably. His father, Kong Qiu, was a soldier, a man of some local standing, but by no means wealthy or politically powerful. The historical records tell us that he was already quite elderly when Confucius was born, and that he died when his son was only 3 years old, leaving the family in reduced circumstances. Confucius was raised by his mother in poverty. The ancient texts do not record her name in full, referring to her only as Yan Zhengzai, the daughter of the Yan family. She was much younger than Kong he had been, and some accounts suggest she had been a concubine rather than a primary wife. This detail, if true, would have added another layer of difficulty to her situation, as concubines and their children occupied an ambiguous position in Chinese society. After her husband's death, she found herself alone, responsible for raising a young child with limited resources and no powerful family connections to rely upon. Despite these hardships, she ensured that her son received an education. Even in poverty, the Kong family belonged to the class known as Shi, a social stratum that existed between the hereditary nobility and the common peasants. The Shi were educated men who served in various capacities as officials, teachers, and ritual specialists. In the early Zhou period, they had been minor aristocrats with small land holdings, but as the feudal system broke down and the old noble families lost their territories, many Shi found themselves without hereditary positions or income. They had lost their inherited positions and land, but they retained their literacy and their knowledge of the ancient classics and rituals that defined Chinese civilization. This created a new kind of social mobility. A man of the she class could rise in status through education and service, or he could sink into poverty if he lacked opportunities. The shy were thus a class in flux, caught between the old aristocratic order that was crumbling and a new merit-based system that had not yet fully emerged. Young Confucius grew up acutely aware of his family's fallen status. He once remarked that in his youth he had been poor and had been forced to acquire many different practical skills to survive. This combination of aristocratic heritage and humble circumstances would profoundly shape his worldview. Unlike many philosophers who came from secure backgrounds, Confucius understood both the responsibilities of high position and the struggles of those without power or wealth. He knew what it meant to work with his hands, to perform menial tasks, to depend on his own efforts for survival. He knew the sting of poverty, the anxiety of uncertainty, the feeling of being looked down upon by those who had inherited better circumstances. Yet he also understood the importance of education, culture, and moral refinement, the things that distinguish civilized human society from mere barbarism. The young boy showed an early interest in ritual and ceremony. Later accounts, which may be somewhat embellished, tell of how even as a child, Confucius would arrange vessels and practice ceremonial movements, playing at performing the sacrifices and rituals that were central to Chinese religious and social life. Whether or not these specific stories are true, they reflect the recognition that Confucius's lifelong preoccupation with ritual had deep roots in his personality and upbringing. In the chaos of the spring and autumn period, when traditional social structures were breaking down, ritual represented stability, order, and connection to the past. For a boy who had lost his father young and who saw the world around him convulsed by violence and change, the unchanging patterns of ritual must have offered a kind of comfort and meaning. The spring and autumn period was an age of intense intellectual ferment. Across the competing states of China, hundreds of teachers and philosophers were developing new systems of thought, each claiming to have discovered the path to social harmony and good government. This flowering of philosophical activity would later be called the era of the 100 schools of thought. Among these various schools were the Taoists, who taught that humanity should follow the natural way and not interfere with the spontaneous order of things. The legendary sage Laozi was said to have been an older contemporary of Confucius, though many scholars believe the text attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, was actually written later by multiple authors. Taoist philosophy emphasized simplicity, naturalness, and non-action, arguing that the less humans tried to control and organize the world, the better off everyone would be. There were the Mohists, followers of Mozi, who advocated universal love and condemned the wastefulness of elaborate rituals and ceremonies. Mozi argued that people should care for all humans equally, not privileging their own families or states, and that resources should be used efficiently to benefit everyone rather than being squandered on expensive rituals and luxuries. The Mohists were egalitarian and utilitarian, judging actions by their practical consequences rather than by conformity to tradition. There were the legalists who believed that only strict laws and harsh punishments could maintain social order. Legalist thinkers like Shang Yang and Han Feizi argued that human nature was fundamentally selfish and that appeals to virtue and morality were naive. Only clear legal codes rigidly enforced could prevent chaos and ensure that people behaved properly. There were also the agriculturalists who believed that rulers should work in the fields alongside their subjects, and the logicians who explored paradoxes and problems of language and reasoning. There were military strategists who wrote treatises on warfare and statecraft, most famously Sun Tzu, author of The Art of War. There were cosmologists and naturalists who studied the patterns of heaven and earth, developing theories about yin and yang, the 5 elements, and the cycles of change. In short, this was a period of extraordinary intellectual creativity and diversity, when fundamental questions about human nature, society, government, and ethics were being debated with unprecedented vigor and sophistication. Into this bustling marketplace of ideas stepped Confucius, a young man from a modest background who believed he had found truth, not in novelty, but in antiquity. While others proposed radical new visions for society, Confucius looked backward to what he believed was a golden age, the early centuries of the Zhou dynasty, when sage kings had ruled with virtue and benevolence. He did not see himself as a creator or innovator, but as a transmitter, someone who would preserve and pass on the wisdom of the ancients to a new generation that was in danger of losing it entirely. This conservative orientation, this reverence for the past, would become one of the defining characteristics of Confucianism, though it should not be misunderstood as simple nostalgia or resistance to all change. Confucius believed that the principles embodied in ancient texts and rituals were timeless truths about human nature and social organization, and that understanding them was essential for addressing the problems of any age. As a young man, Confucius worked in a series of modest positions to support himself and his mother. His first known employment was as keeper of the granary in Lu, responsible for overseeing the storage and distribution of grain. This was an important if unglamorous task, as grain storage was crucial for feeding the population and for providing reserves in case of poor harvests. Later, he served as supervisor of the fields, managing agricultural lands and probably overseeing the peasants who worked them. These were not prestigious positions, but they were appropriate for someone of shy status, and they gave Confucius practical experience in administration and governance. He learned about the details of managing resources, about the challenges of working with people from different backgrounds, about the gap between noble ideals and messy reality. More importantly, these positions allowed him time to pursue his real passion, which was the study of the ancient texts and rituals of the early Zhou dynasty. Confucius immersed himself in the classics, the ancient books of poetry, history, ritual, and divination that preserved the wisdom of the sage kings who had ruled in China's golden age. He studied the Book of Odes, a collection of over 300 poems that dealt with themes ranging from courtship and marriage to statecraft and divine worship. These poems, composed in various regions of China during the early Zhou period, offered insights into the emotions, values, and social conditions of that era. Confucius believed that poetry was not just aesthetic entertainment, but a means of moral education. Through poetry, students could develop refined emotional responses, learn to recognize virtue and vice, and see how personal feelings connected to larger social and moral realities. He studied the Book of Documents, also known as the Book of History, which contained speeches and decrees attributed to the sage kings, Yao, Shun, and Yu, as well as to the founders of the Zhou dynasty. These texts showed how virtuous rulers addressed their ministers and people, how they made decisions in difficult circumstances, how they balanced firmness and compassion. They provided models of eloquence and wisdom that Confucius believed contemporary rulers should emulate. He studied texts on ritual and ceremony, detailed guides to proper conduct in every conceivable situation, from royal audiences to family gatherings, from religious sacrifices to diplomatic meetings. These ritual texts encoded the social hierarchies and relationships that Confucius believed were essential for an orderly society. According to the traditional accounts, Confucius began his career as a teacher around the age of 30. By this time, he had already acquired a reputation for learning and moral character. The traditional sources credit him with teaching more than 3,000 students over the course of his lifetime, though historians consider this number to be somewhat exaggerated. What is certain is that he attracted a significant following, and that he did something quite revolutionary for his time. He made education available to anyone who wished to learn, regardless of their social status or wealth. His only requirement was that a prospective student bring him a symbolic gift of a bundle of dried meat, a token offering that demonstrated respect and sincerity rather than material wealth. This democratization of education was a radical departure from previous practice. Before Confucius, education had been largely the preserve of the aristocracy, passed down through family lines and carefully guarded by those who held power. Young nobles learned the arts necessary for their station, reading and writing in the ancient script, mastery of the rituals appropriate to their rank, skill with bow and chariot in preparation for military service. Commoners, by contrast, learned only the practical skills needed for their occupations, farming or craftsmanship, transmitted through apprenticeship and observation rather than formal instruction. The idea that anyone, regardless of birth, could seek education and moral improvement was essentially foreign to the traditional social order. Confucius believed that virtue and ability, not birth, should determine a person's place in society. He taught that through education and self-cultivation, any person could become a junzi, a term that originally meant nobleman or gentleman, someone of aristocratic birth, but which Confucius redefined to mean a person of moral excellence and refined character. The junzi was not someone born into privilege, but someone who had worked to develop inner virtue through study, reflection, and ethical conduct. This was a profoundly meritocratic vision for a hierarchical society, and it contained within it the seeds of significant social change. If anyone could become a junzi through education, then the old aristocratic order based purely on heredity was called into question. A new elite based on cultivation and character could emerge, potentially replacing or at least supplementing the hereditary nobility. The curriculum that Confucius taught was based on what would later be called the 6 arts. These included ritual, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. Ritual, as we have seen, encompassed everything from religious ceremonies to social etiquette. Music included not just performance, but also the theory and philosophy of music, its role in harmonizing emotions and cultivating character. Archery and charioteering were the traditional military skills of the aristocracy, though Confucius was more interested in the discipline and focus they required than in their practical military application. Calligraphy meant both beautiful writing and mastery of the complex Chinese script, which was essential for reading the ancient texts. Mathematics included not just arithmetic, but also the numerical patterns that were believed to underlie cosmic order. However, Confucius was not simply teaching practical skills. His primary concern was moral education, the cultivation of character and virtue. He wanted his students to internalize the values and principles that he believed had made the early Zhou dynasty great. Through the study of ancient texts, especially the Book of Odes and the Book of Documents, students learned about the deeds of the sage kings and virtuous ministers of antiquity. They saw examples of wise judgment, benevolent rule, loyal service, and moral courage. Through the practice of ritual and music, they learned proper conduct and developed emotional harmony. Ritual taught them how to show respect, how to interact with others appropriately, how to control their behavior, even in emotionally charged situations. Music refined their feelings, teaching them to respond to beauty and order, to experience the full range of human emotions in a disciplined and constructive way. Through discussion and reflection, students learn to think ethically about their responsibilities to family, society, and state. Confucius did not lecture in the manner of a modern professor, presenting systematic arguments and theories. Instead, he engaged in dialogue with his students, responding to their questions, commenting on their behavior, using stories and analogies to illustrate points. The Analects preserves many of these exchanges, brief conversations in which Confucius answers a question with another question or responds to the same query differently depending on who is asking and what their particular strengths and weaknesses are. This dialectical method required students to think actively, to struggle with ideas, to discover truth through their own efforts rather than simply absorbing doctrines passively. Central to Confucius's teaching was the concept of ren, often translated as benevolence, humaneness, or humanity. Ren was the highest virtue, the quality that defined what it meant to be fully human. It encompassed compassion, empathy, and concern for others. A person of Ren treated all people with kindness and respect, not because of any expectation of reward or advantage, but because such treatment was intrinsically right. Confucius taught that Ren began with proper conduct toward one's own family, particularly with filial piety, the duty of children to honor and care for their parents. This was not a one-sided obligation, but part of a web of mutual responsibilities. Parents cared for children when they were young and helpless. Children cared for parents when they were old and feeble. This reciprocity extended outward to include other relationships, between siblings, between spouses, between friends, between rulers and subjects. From this foundation in the family, the circle of moral concern expanded outward to include friends, neighbors, fellow citizens, and ultimately all of humanity. However, Confucius did not advocate the kind of universal, undifferentiated love that the Mohists would later propose. He believed that love and obligation naturally had different strengths depending on the closeness of the relationship. You had greater responsibility to your parents than to strangers, to your siblings than to distant acquaintances. This graded or graduated love reflected the natural order of human relationships and was more realistic and sustainable than trying to care for everyone equally. The challenge was to extend the feelings of care that came naturally within the family outward to encompass larger and larger circles, eventually embracing all of humanity within one's moral concern. Another key concept in Confucian thought was li, which is often translated as ritual, propriety, or proper conduct. Li encompassed everything from formal religious ceremonies to everyday etiquette and manners. The term had ancient roots, originally referring specifically to religious sacrifices to ancestors and deities. Over time, its meaning had expanded to include all the formal behaviors that structured social interactions and marked important life events. There were rituals for births and deaths, for coming of age and marriage, for receiving guests and conducting business. There were proper ways to dress, to speak, to move, to eat. Every aspect of life had its appropriate form, its correct procedure. In an age of chaos and violence, Confucius saw ritual as a stabilizing force, a way of imposing order and meaning on human interactions. When people followed the proper forms and ceremonies, they were not merely going through empty motions. They were participating in a tradition that connected them to their ancestors and to the great sages of the past. They were enacting values of respect, hierarchy, and mutual obligation that held society together. Li taught people how to behave in different situations, how to show respect to elders and superiors, how to conduct oneself with dignity and grace. It provided a framework that made social interactions predictable and comfortable, reducing the anxiety and conflict that arose from uncertainty about how to behave. However, Confucius insisted that ritual had to be performed with the right inner attitude. Simply going through the motions mechanically without genuine feeling and understanding turned ritual into empty formalism. When asked whether ritual was more about expensive offerings or sincere reverence, Confucius made clear that sincerity was essential. The outward forms mattered, but they mattered because they expressed and shaped inner states of mind and heart. Proper ritual performance required concentration, attentiveness, and emotional engagement. Done correctly, ritual was transformative, reshaping desires and developing moral dispositions. It was a kind of moral technology, a way of training the self through repeated practice in prescribed forms. Confucius also emphasized the importance of yi, righteousness or moral correctness. Yi meant doing what was right simply because it was right, not because of any personal advantage. It was the quality that allowed a person to stand firm in their principles, even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. A person of yi would not compromise their integrity for wealth or power, would not remain silent in the face of injustice, would not abandon their duties even when no one was watching. Yi required moral courage, the willingness to act on one's convictions even at personal cost. It was closely related to another important virtue, zhi, which meant wisdom or moral knowledge. Zhi was not mere cleverness or intellectual ability, but the capacity to discern right from wrong, to understand the proper course of action in complex situations, to see through appearances to underlying realities. The concept of the junzi, the morally cultivated person or gentleman, integrated all these virtues. The junzi possessed ren and practiced li, upheld yi and developed zi. But the junzi was not just an abstract ideal. Confucius tried to describe concretely what such a person would be like in everyday life. The junzi was modest and humble, never boastful or self-aggrandizing. The junzi was careful in speech, saying only what needed to be said and meaning what he said. The junzi was constant in friendship, loyal to those who deserved loyalty. The junzi was adaptable in conduct, adjusting to circumstances while maintaining moral principles. The junzi sought to blame himself rather than others when things went wrong, examining his own conduct before criticizing those around him. The junzi was firm in adversity, not allowing hardship to shake his commitment to virtue. The junzi was discriminating in pleasure, enjoying music, poetry, and good company, but not becoming enslaved to sensory indulgence. In contrast to the junzi was the xiaoren, the small person or petty person. The xiaoren was concerned only with personal profit and advantage. The xiaoren was inconsistent, changing behavior to suit circumstances rather than adhering to principles. The xiaoren blamed others for failures and took credit for successes. The xiaoren was narrow in outlook, unable to see beyond immediate self-interest. Confucius was not saying that junzi and xiaoren were fixed categories determined by birth. Rather, they represented tendencies that anyone could move toward or away from depending on their choices and cultivation. Education was the process of moving from xiaoren toward junzi, of developing one's moral potential through study and practice. The historical record tells us that around the year 518 before the Common Era, when Confucius was in his early 30s, he met with Laozi, the legendary sage who was said to be the founder of Taoism. According to the story, Confucius traveled to Luoyang, the capital of the weakened Zhou dynasty, where Laozi served as keeper of the royal archives. Confucius, eager to learn from this renowned wise man, asked him about the ancient rituals and ceremonies. Laozi reportedly responded with sharp criticism, telling Confucius that he was too concerned with outward forms and dead traditions, that he was stuffy and arrogant, that he should let go of his ambitions and pride. He advised Confucius to stop trying to impose order on the world and instead flow with the natural way of things. This encounter, if it actually occurred, highlighted a fundamental difference in philosophical approach, where Confucius emphasized ritual, social order, and active engagement with the world. Taoist philosophy advocated for spontaneity, natural simplicity, and withdrawal from worldly concerns. Laozi taught that the more humans tried to control and organize things, the worse they made them. Artificial social hierarchies, elaborate ceremonies, complex moral codes, all these actually interfered with the natural harmony that would emerge if people simply followed their innate nature. The best government was the one that governed least, allowing people to live simply and naturally without interference. The wise person withdrew from the competition for status and power, cultivating inner tranquility rather than trying to change the world. Confucius fundamentally disagreed with this approach. He believed that human beings were social creatures who needed structure, guidance, and cultivation. Left to their raw, natural impulses, people would be selfish and destructive. It was precisely through education, ritual, and moral cultivation that human nature was refined and developed. Without these civilizing influences, society would descend into chaos. The sage did not withdraw from the world, but engaged with it, working to create order and promote virtue. This debate between Confucian activism and Taoist quietism would continue throughout Chinese intellectual history, with thinkers on both sides developing increasingly sophisticated arguments. Many individuals would find value in both approaches, being Confucian in their public life and Taoist in their private reflections. Despite such criticisms from other philosophical traditions, Confucius continued to develop and teach his philosophy. His reputation grew steadily, and eventually he was offered a position in the government of Lu. The traditional accounts vary in their details, but most agree that around the age of 50, Confucius was appointed to a significant administrative post. Some sources say he served as governor of Zhongdu, a town within Lu, others that he became Minister of Crime or Minister of Public Works. What seems clear is that he was given real responsibility and that he used his position to try to implement his ideas about good governance. He believed that the key to social order was not harsh laws and punishments, but moral example. If the rulers were virtuous, if they followed the principles of Ren and Li, then the common people would naturally be inspired to behave well. If the rulers were corrupt and selfish, no amount of legal coercion would prevent social decay. For a time, it seemed that Confucius's ideas might actually be put into practice in Lu. According to the traditional accounts, crime decreased, people became more courteous and respectful, and the state prospered under his guidance. Markets were orderly, people returned lost items to their owners, and there was a general atmosphere of honesty and civility. However, this golden moment was not to last. The internal politics of Lu were complex and treacherous. Real power lay not with the duke, the nominal ruler, but with three powerful families known as the Three Huan. These families, descendants of Duke Huan of Lu, controlled most of the state's territory and resources through their private retainers and fortifications. They were more interested in their own advantage than in moral governance. When Confucius's reforms threatened their interests, they maneuvered to have him removed from office. Some accounts tell that Confucius proposed dismantling the private fortresses of these great families, arguing that such strongholds undermined the duke's authority and divided the state. The families naturally resisted this proposal, and Confucius found himself outmaneuvered politically. Another story says that a neighboring state, Qi, worried about Lu becoming too strong under Confucius's administration, sent the duke a gift of 80 beautiful dancers and fine horses to distract him from affairs of state. The duke accepted the gift and spent 3 days enjoying the entertainments without attending to government business. Moreover, he failed to send the required portions of sacrificial meat to Confucius after a major state ceremony, a serious breach of protocol that showed disrespect. Seeing this abandonment of proper conduct and the duke's preference for pleasure over duty, Confucius resigned from his position in disgust and disappointment. This moment, around the year 497 before the Common Era, marked a major turning point in Confucius's life. He was now in his mid-50s, his hopes of implementing his political philosophy apparently dashed. Rather than remain in Lu, where his talents were not appreciated, he decided to seek employment elsewhere. Accompanied by a group of his most devoted disciples, he began a period of wandering that would last for more than a decade. This journey would take him through many of the competing states of China, from Wei to Song to Chen to Chu to Kai and beyond. In each place, he would seek an audience with the local ruler, hoping to find an enlightened sovereign who would employ him and allow him to put his ideas into practice. The journey was difficult and often dangerous. The group travelled on foot or in simple ox carts, dependent on the hospitality of local officials and the occasional gifts from former students who had risen to positions of influence. They frequently faced hardship and hunger. On one occasion, in the state of Chen, when they were travelling to Chu, they became lost in the countryside between the two states and ran out of provisions. For several days, the group survived on wild plants and whatever else they could scavenge, growing weak from hunger. Some of the disciples became discouraged and questioned whether it was worth continuing. Confucius remained steadfast, insisting that a true gentleman did not abandon his principles even in the direst circumstances. In the state of Song, they faced a more direct threat. A military commander named Wan Tui, who opposed Confucius's ideas and perhaps felt personally criticized by his teachings, arranged an ambush. According to the story, Confucius and his disciples were resting under a large tree when Huan Tui's men appeared and began cutting it down, intending to kill them as it fell. The group managed to escape, but they had to flee quickly, leaving behind their belongings. When the disciples expressed fear about this narrow escape, Confucius reportedly said that since heaven had given him his moral mission, what could Huan Tui do to him? This statement reflected Confucius's belief that he had a heaven-ordained purpose to preserve and transmit the way of the ancient sages, and that this mission would be protected by heaven itself. In another incident, Confucius was mistaken for a notorious adventurer and mercenary named Yang Hu, who apparently resembled him physically and who had caused trouble in the region. He was arrested by the people of the town of Quang and held for 5 days before the authorities realized their mistake and released him. Throughout these trials, Confucius maintained his composure and his commitment to his principles. He saw these hardships as tests of character, opportunities to demonstrate the very virtues he taught his students. He refused to abandon ritual and propriety even in the most difficult circumstances. When resources were scarce, he still insisted on proper conduct in eating and drinking. When facing danger, he remained calm and dignified rather than panicking or abandoning his companions. During these years of travel, Confucius's relationship with his disciples deepened profoundly. These were not ordinary students who attended classes and then went home. They were devoted followers who had left their own families and careers to accompany their teacher on this uncertain quest. They shared his hardships, his dangers, his disappointments. They formed a kind of alternative community bound together by shared values and mutual commitment. Within this community, ritual and proper conduct were strictly observed, creating an oasis of order and civility in a world of chaos and violence. The disciples studied the ancient texts together, discussed philosophical questions, and observed how Confucius himself behaved in different situations. They learned not just from his formal teachings, but from his example, from the way he carried himself with dignity in adversity, from his unfailing courtesy even to those who did not respect him, from his dedication to principle over personal advantage. The disciples came from various backgrounds and had different personalities and abilities. Some were earnest and diligent, others clever and quick-witted, still others strong-willed and sometimes argumentative. Confucius tailored his teaching to each individual, addressing their particular weaknesses and strengths. To a student who was too cautious, he might offer encouragement to be bolder. To one who was too impetuous, he would counsel restraint and reflection. This individualized approach showed Confucius's deep understanding of human nature and his skill as an educator. He did not simply impart a fixed body of knowledge, but worked to develop each student's moral character and practical wisdom. Among the disciples, certain figures stood out and became famous in later tradition. Yan Hui, also known as Yan Yuan, was often described as Confucius's favorite student, a young man of exceptional virtue and dedication to learning. Confucius praised him repeatedly in the Analects for his love of learning, his humility, his ability to avoid repeating mistakes, and his contentment even in poverty. Yan Hui lived simply, eating plain food and drinking water, living in a poor neighborhood, circumstances that would have depressed others, yet he remained cheerful and focused on his studies. Confucius said that he never saw Yan Hui take pleasure in anything except learning, and that he did not transfer his anger inappropriately or make the same mistake twice. When Yan Hui died young, probably in his early 30s, Confucius was devastated, crying out that heaven had forsaken him. The other disciples had to restrain him from excessive grief, reminding him that such displays were unseemly. But Confucius replied that if he could not mourn extravagantly for Yan Hui, then for whom could he mourn? Another important disciple was Zilu, also known as Zhong Yu. Zilu was a bold and sometimes hot-headed man who had once been something of a rough fighter or brigand before becoming Confucius's student. He was known for his courage, his physical strength, and his intense loyalty to his teacher. Zilu was always ready to defend Confucius, sometimes more ready to use force than wisdom would dictate. Confucius had to continually counsel him to temper his courage with caution and reflection, to think before acting, to recognize that bravery without righteousness was merely recklessness. Yet Confucius also valued Zilu's straightforward honesty and his dedication. Zilu died violently in a political conflict, and even in death he maintained proper conduct, stopping to straighten his hat before being killed, because a gentleman should not die without his ceremonial cap properly fastened. Zigong, also known as Duanmu Ci, was known for his eloquence, his diplomatic skills, and his business acumen. He was wealthy, having succeeded as a merchant, and he used his resources to help his teacher and fellow students. Zigong was clever and articulate, sometimes too clever, and Confucius had to remind him not to judge others too quickly or to rely too much on verbal facility. Nevertheless, Zigong became one of the most effective promoters of Confucian ideas after his teacher's death, using his wealth and political connections to spread the teachings and defend Confucius's reputation. When someone asked Zigong if Confucius was a sage, Zigong replied that Confucius was indeed a sage, one given by heaven exceptional and comprehensive gifts that could not be learned by mere study alone. Zhengzi, whose personal name was Zhengshen, was noted for his filial piety and his attention to cultivating virtue through daily practice. He was especially concerned with self-examination and moral vigilance, reportedly checking himself 3 times each day to ensure he was fulfilling his responsibilities faithfully. Zhengzi emphasized the importance of sincerity and authenticity, insisting that virtue had to be genuine and deeply rooted, not merely superficial conformity to external norms. He would later become an important transmitter of Confucian teachings to the next generation, with Confucius's grandson Zisi studying under him. This lineage from Confucius through Zhengzi to Zisi and then to Mencius became one of the most important streams of Confucian tradition. Other notable disciples included Ran Chu, also known as Rang Yu, who was skilled in administrative and financial matters and who later held an important position in the household of the Ji family, one of the 3 powerful clans in Lu. Confucius sometimes criticized Ran Chu for being too cautious and for serving masters whose behavior was questionable, but he also recognized his practical abilities. There was Min Sun, known as Min Ziqian, who was famous for his filial piety. When his father wanted to give him an official position, Min Ziqian declined, saying that if pressed again, he would have to move beyond the borders of Lu because he could not, in good conscience, serve a government that was not following the right way. There was Zai Yu, also known as Zai Wo, who was brilliant but sometimes lazy. Once, when Confucius found him sleeping during the daytime, he lamented that rotten wood cannot be carved and dirty walls cannot be whitewashed, using Zai Yu as an example of wasted potential. Each of these disciples, and the many others whose names appear in the ancient texts, added their own perspective and personality to the emerging Confucian tradition. They were not identical copies of their teacher, but individuals who understood and applied his teachings in their own ways. This diversity would prove crucial for the survival and growth of Confucianism, allowing it to adapt to different circumstances and appeal to different temperaments. Throughout his wanderings, Confucius never found the enlightened ruler he sought. In each state, he would meet with the local duke or marquis, discuss principles of government, and hope for an appointment. Sometimes he was treated with respect, sometimes with indifference, sometimes with suspicion or even hostility. The rulers of this era were primarily concerned with military power and territorial expansion, not with moral philosophy. They wanted advisors who could help them defeat their enemies and increase their wealth, not teachers who talked about ancient rituals and the importance of virtue. Confucius's ideas seemed impractical, even naive, to men whose survival depended on their ability to outmaneuver ruthless rivals. In the state of Wei, Confucius spent considerable time at the court of Duke Ling. The Duke was interested in talking with Confucius about philosophy, but was dominated by his wife, the notorious Nancy, who had a reputation for scandalous behavior. When Confucius, following protocol, agreed to meet with Nancy, his disciple Zilu was troubled, worried that this compromised his teacher's moral standards. Confucius had to reassure Zilu that the meeting was purely formal and that he had done nothing improper. Despite spending time in Wei and receiving a salary, Confucius was never given any real responsibility in government, and Duke Ling continued to focus on military affairs rather than moral reform. In the state of Chu, one of the most powerful southern states, Confucius was invited by an official who hoped the Duke would employ him. But the plan was opposed by other ministers who feared that Confucius's ideas would threaten their positions. They told the Duke that Confucius's disciples were exceptionally talented men who might outshine Chu's own officials, and that bringing Confucius to power would ultimately undermine the Duke's interests. The Duke listened to these warnings and decided not to employ Confucius after all. This pattern repeated itself over and over. Rulers enjoyed talking with Confucius, valued him as a teacher and philosopher, but would not actually implement his political recommendations or give him significant authority. This period of rejection and wandering must have been deeply discouraging. Confucius was now in his 60s, his physical strength declining, his hopes of finding an enlightened ruler fading. Some of his disciples had died or gone their separate ways. The ancient texts he so revered seemed increasingly irrelevant to a world that cared only for power and profit. Yet Confucius never lost faith in his mission. He believed that he had been given a mandate by heaven to preserve and transmit the wisdom of the ancient sages. Even if no contemporary ruler would listen to him, even if he never held high office again, he could still teach the next generation. He could prepare students who might one day have the opportunity to implement these ideas. He could preserve the ancient texts and rituals that were in danger of being lost in the chaos of the age. In this sense, his years of wandering were not wasted. They deepened his understanding of human nature and society, they tested and refined his ideas, and they gave his disciples a shared experience of hardship and dedication that bound them together and prepared them to carry on his work after his death. By around the year 484 before the Common Era, when Confucius was approaching 70 years old, he finally returned to his native state of Lu. The circumstances of his return are not entirely clear from the historical sources. It appears that some of his former students, who had achieved positions of influence in Lu, arranged for him to come back. These included Ran Chu, who was serving the powerful Ji family and who had distinguished himself in a military campaign. The Ji family and others in Lu may have hoped that bringing the famous teacher back would add prestige to the state and provide wise counsel, even if they had no intention of giving him direct political authority. Whatever the specific arrangement, Confucius spent his last years in Lu, not in active government service, but in teaching and working with texts. During this final period, Confucius devoted himself to working with the ancient texts that he believed contained the wisdom essential for civilized life. He is traditionally credited with editing or compiling several of the works that would become the core classics of Chinese civilization, though modern scholars debate the extent of his actual involvement with these texts. The Book of Odes, a collection of over 300 poems from various periods and regions, was said to have been selected and arranged by Confucius from a much larger body of ancient poetry. These poems dealt with themes of love and courtship, family life and farming, government and warfare, religious worship, and moral instruction. Confucius believed that poetry could refine the emotions and develop moral sensitivity. By studying how the ancient poems expressed feelings and situations, students learned to recognize and articulate their own emotional responses, to distinguish appropriate from inappropriate feelings, and to develop empathy for others. The Book of Documents, also known as the Book of History, contains speeches and documents from the legendary sage kings Yao, Shun, and Yu, as well as from the founders of the Shang and Zhou dynasties. It provided examples of virtuous leadership and proper governance, showing how wise rulers addressed their ministers and people, how they made difficult decisions, how they balanced different considerations. These ancient texts were not easy to understand, being written in an archaic language quite different from the speech of Confucius's own time. Part of Confucius's work was interpreting and explaining these texts, making them accessible to his students and showing their continued relevance. The Spring and Autumn Annals, the chronicle of the state of Lu, covering the period from 722 to 481 before the Common Era, is the work most directly attributed to Confucius's own hand. Unlike other ancient chronicles, which simply recorded events without commentary, this text was believed to embody subtle moral judgments through its precise choice of words and phrases. The way an event was described, the title used for a person, the order in which things were mentioned, all these were thought to convey praise or blame, approval or condemnation. Later scholars would spend countless hours analyzing these subtle nuances, trying to understand Confucius's moral vision through his historical writing. For example, when a ruler acted improperly, the annals might record the event but use terminology that implied criticism. When a subordinate exceeded his proper role, the text would note this through careful word choice. When proper ritual was observed or violated, the annals would indicate this through its descriptions. This practice of using historical writing to convey moral lessons, of treating history not just as a record of what happened, but as an ethical teaching tool, would become a distinctive feature of Chinese historiography. Confucius believed that by studying the past and understanding which actions led to order and which to chaos, students could learn how to act virtuously in their own time. The Book of Changes, or Yi Jing, was an ancient divination manual that used a system of 64 hexagrams, each composed of 6 lines that were either solid or broken to represent different states and transformations. Confucius is said to have written commentaries on this text, known as the 10 Wings, which interpreted the hexagrams in philosophical and ethical terms rather than purely as divination tools. These commentaries explored themes of cosmic change and human adaptability, the relationship between heaven and earth, the interaction of yin and yang, and the importance of timing in human affairs. Whether Confucius actually authored these specific commentaries is debated by scholars, but their attribution to him indicates the reverence with which later generations regarded his wisdom and the belief that he had transformed this ancient fortune-telling text into a profound philosophical work. Finally, there were texts about ritual and music, detailed guides to proper conduct and ceremony that preserved the traditions of the early Zhou dynasty. These included descriptions of court ceremonies, protocols for diplomatic meetings, procedures for sacrifices and religious rites, rules for family ceremonies like weddings and funerals, and standards for music and dance appropriate to different occasions. Confucius believed that these ritual texts were not just antiquarian curiosities, but living guides that could help restore order to society. By re-establishing proper ritual practices, by training people to perform ceremonies correctly and with the right inner attitude, society could be gradually transformed and the moral standards of the Golden Age could be revived. In the year 479 before the Common Era, at the age of 72 or 73, Confucius died in Khufu, the capital of Lu. The traditional accounts say he died of natural causes, though he had been grieving the recent deaths of several beloved disciples, including his son Kong Qiu. His son had died before him, a tragedy that left Confucius without a direct male heir to continue his work, though his grandson Zisi would eventually take up that role. In his final days, Confucius reportedly lamented that his ideas had not been adopted by any ruler, that he had failed in his mission to restore the golden age of the early Zhou. One morning, a disciple saw him walking in front of his door, humming a sad song. When asked what troubled him, Confucius replied that he had dreamed he was sitting between 2 pillars, receiving sacrifices, the kind of funeral ceremony appropriate for someone of high status. He interpreted this dream as an omen of his approaching death. He then spoke bitterly about his life's work, saying that no enlightened king had emerged to implement his ideas, that the way was not being put into practice, that he would soon die without having achieved his goals. He took to his bed and died 7 days later, surrounded by his disciples. Yet despite this apparent sense of failure, Confucius had in fact accomplished something far more significant than he could have known. He had trained a community of devoted disciples who would ensure that his teachings survived and spread. He had demonstrated through his own life what it meant to maintain moral integrity in difficult circumstances. He had preserved and transmitted the ancient wisdom that might otherwise have been lost. And he had planted seeds that would grow into one of the most influential philosophical and ethical traditions in human history. After Confucius's death, his disciples observed the traditional 3-year mourning period, living in simple huts near his grave and observing the rituals of bereavement. His most devoted student, Zigong, reportedly remained at the grave for a total of 6 years, unable to tear himself away from his beloved teacher. The disciples then scattered to different states, carrying Confucius's teachings with them. Many became officials in various governments, bringing Confucian ethical principles into practical administration. Others established their own schools, passing on what they had learned to a new generation of students. They also began the crucial work of recording and organizing Confucius's teachings for posterity. None of Confucius's own writings, except possibly the Spring and Autumn Annals, survived in the form he created them. Everything else we know about his philosophy comes from the records kept by his disciples and their students. The most important of these records is the Analects, known in Chinese as the Lunyu, which means something like selected sayings or edited conversations. This text, compiled over several decades after Confucius's death, consists of brief passages recording his words and deeds, gathered from the memories and notes of different disciples. The compilation process was probably gradual, with different disciples preserving different collections of sayings and stories, which were eventually brought together and organized into the 20 chapters or books that make up the received text. Some chapters may represent the traditions of particular disciples or their schools, each preserving slightly different aspects of the master's teachings. The fragmentary nature of the Analects has made it both frustratingly difficult and endlessly fascinating for later readers. Without lengthy explanations or systematic arguments, readers must piece together Confucius's worldview from scattered remarks and examples. The same concepts appear again and again in different contexts, allowing readers to gradually develop a feel for what Confucius meant by terms like Ren, Li, and Junzi. The text does not present a complete philosophical system, but rather provides materials for constructing one, inviting each generation of readers to interpret and apply these teachings to their own circumstances. This openness has allowed Confucianism to remain vital and relevant across vastly different historical periods and social conditions. The text also preserves a vivid sense of Confucius as a person, not just as an abstract philosopher. We see him enjoying music so much that for 3 months after hearing a particular performance he said, "Meat had no taste," so absorbed was he in the beauty of what he had heard. We see him commenting on current events, praising some officials and criticizing others. We see him joking with students, expressing frustration when they misunderstand him, showing sadness when they disappoint him or when they die. We see him as someone deeply engaged with life, not a remote sage dwelling in abstract contemplation, but a real human being with emotions, preferences, strengths, and weaknesses. This humanity makes Confucius accessible and relatable, a model of virtue that seems achievable rather than impossibly remote. And so the teachings spread, carried by devoted disciples to all corners of the Chinese world. The transmission continued through generations, with students of Confucius teaching their own students, who taught others in turn. The work of preserving and transmitting Confucian teachings fell especially to certain lineages. As mentioned, Zhengzi taught Zisi, Confucius's grandson, who in turn influenced the development of texts like the Doctrine of the Mean. This text explored the concept of zhongyong, balance and moderation, the idea that virtue lay in finding the appropriate middle way between extremes. The Doctrine of the Mean taught that sincerity and authenticity were at the heart of moral cultivation, that genuinely feeling and meaning what one expressed in ritual was essential for true virtue. Another important text that emerged from early Confucian circles was the Great Learning, which outlined a program of moral and political development. It argued that peace and order in the world depended on good government in the state, which depended on harmony in families, which depended on self-cultivation in individuals. The process began with investigating things and extending knowledge, proceeded through making thoughts sincere and hearts rectified, through cultivating the person and regulating the family, and culminated in ordering the state and bringing peace to the world. This text provided a systematic framework for understanding how personal ethics connected to political outcomes, how individual moral development was the foundation for larger social transformation. These texts, along with the Analects and Mencius, would eventually be designated by Neo-Confucian philosophers as the Four Books, the essential core of Confucian learning. But in the immediate aftermath of Confucius's death, his disciples were also deeply concerned with preserving the five classics, the ancient texts that Confucius himself had studied and taught. These were the foundation of Chinese cultural tradition, and the disciples saw themselves as guardians of this heritage. Different schools or traditions within the early Confucian community maintained slightly different emphases and interpretations, but all saw themselves as faithful preservers of the master's teaching. Some emphasized his teachings about ritual and ceremony, others his political philosophy, still others his ethical doctrines about Ren and Yi. This multiplicity of perspectives actually enriched Confucianism, allowing it to develop and adapt while remaining rooted in core principles. The tradition was living and dynamic, not a fixed and rigid orthodoxy. In the generations after Confucius's death, his ideas gradually gained influence, though the process was slow and uneven. The Warring States period, which began around 475 before the Common Era, was even more violent and chaotic than the Spring and Autumn period had been. The major states grew larger and more powerful, swallowing up smaller neighbors through military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering. The wars became more destructive as new military technologies and organizational methods were developed. Iron weapons replaced bronze, large infantry armies replaced aristocratic chariot forces, and the scale of warfare expanded dramatically. States mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers, built massive fortifications, and devoted enormous resources to military competition. In this environment of constant conflict, many rulers and officials were searching for solutions to the problems of social order and effective government. Different philosophical schools competed for patronage and influence, each claiming to have the answer to the crisis of the age. Confucians argued for moral cultivation and ritual propriety as the foundations of good government. Mohists advocated universal love and utilitarian efficiency. Legalists insisted on strict laws and harsh punishments. Taoists recommended minimal government interference and natural spontaneity. These schools debated each other vigorously, sometimes in formal court settings, where rulers would listen to representatives of different traditions argue their positions. Two later Confucian thinkers would play crucial roles in developing and spreading Confucian philosophy during this turbulent Warring States period. The first was Mencius, known in Chinese as Mengzi, who lived from approximately 372 to 289 before the Common Era, about a century after Confucius. Born in the small state of Zhou, near Lu, Mencius claimed the lineage of Confucian teaching through Zisi, Confucius's grandson, though the exact chain of transmission is uncertain. Like Confucius, Mencius spent many years traveling from state to state, visiting the courts of various rulers and offering advice. Like Confucius, he was largely disappointed in this quest, finding that rulers wanted practical techniques for increasing their power rather than moral philosophy. But his teachings, recorded by his disciples in the book called the Mencius, became a central text of the Confucian tradition and greatly enriched and developed the master's original insights. Mencius made several important contributions to Confucian thought. He argued forcefully and systematically that human nature was fundamentally good. This was a direct response to other thinkers who claimed that humans were naturally selfish or evil. Mencius used various arguments to support his position. He pointed to natural emotional responses, like the instinctive alarm and concern everyone feels when seeing a child about to fall into a well. This reaction, he argued, was not calculated, but spontaneous, revealing an innate tendency toward compassion. He also used analogies from nature. Just as water naturally flows downward unless obstructed, human nature naturally tends toward goodness unless corrupted by bad circumstances or influences. People were born with innate moral feelings, natural tendencies toward compassion for others' suffering, shame at wrong action, respect for others, and the ability to discern right from wrong. These moral feelings, or sprouts, as Mencius called them, needed to be cultivated and nurtured through education and practice. If they were neglected or suppressed by bad environment or bad choices, people could become cruel and selfish. But this was a distortion of their true nature, not its fulfillment. Mencius used agricultural metaphors extensively, comparing moral cultivation to farming. Just as crops needed proper soil, water, and care to grow, moral sprouts needed the right environment and cultivation to develop fully. If crops failed, it was not because their nature was bad, but because they had not received proper care. Similarly, if people behaved badly, it was not because they were innately evil, but because their moral nature had not been properly nurtured. This optimistic view of human nature provided a philosophical foundation for Confucian education. If people were naturally inclined toward goodness, then the purpose of teaching was not to impose virtue from outside against the grain of human nature, but to nurture and develop what was already within. Education was like cultivation, bringing out potential that already existed, rather than creating something entirely new. This meant that everyone had the capacity to become a sage, at least in principle, because everyone possessed the fundamental moral feelings. The difference between a sage and an ordinary person was not a difference in kind, but a difference in degree of cultivation. This egalitarian implication, though not fully worked out by Mencius, would have significant long-term influence on how Confucians thought about human potential and social hierarchy. Mencius also developed Confucius's ideas about government into a more explicit political philosophy. He argued forcefully that the legitimacy of rulers depended on their moral character and their care for the people's welfare. Heaven granted its mandate, the right to rule, only to those who governed benevolently and justly. If a ruler became tyrannical and oppressive, if he exploited the people for his own benefit, if he failed to provide for their basic needs and welfare, then heaven would withdraw its mandate. Natural disasters, social unrest, and eventual overthrow were signs that heaven had removed its approval. The people would be justified in overthrowing such a tyrant, and a new, more virtuous ruler would receive heaven's mandate. This theory of legitimate resistance to tyranny was radical for its time. While it did not advocate democracy or popular sovereignty in the modern sense, it did insist that political authority was conditional and revocable, that government existed to serve the people rather than the other way around. Mencius told rulers bluntly that the people were the most important element in a state, that the spirits of the land and grain came next, and that the ruler was least important. This inverted the usual hierarchy and implied that rulers who failed in their duties could and should be replaced. When one king asked Mencius whether it was permissible for a subject to kill his ruler, Mencius replied that one who violated benevolence was just a villain, and one who violated righteousness was just a criminal, and that killing such a villain and criminal was not killing a king at all. This was a shocking statement that challenged the absolute authority of rulers and insisted on their accountability to higher moral standards. Mencius also developed detailed ideas about economic policy and the welfare state. He argued that good government had to ensure that people had adequate means to support themselves and their families. If people lacked secure livelihoods, if they could not feed themselves through the honest work, they would inevitably turn to crime and disorder. Therefore, a wise ruler would ensure that people had access to land for farming, that taxes were reasonable and predictable, that there were reserves for times of famine or disaster. Mencius proposed specific policies, such as the well-field system, an idealized form of communal land distribution where 8 families would each farm private plots around the edges of a square, with the 9th central plot farmed communally and its produce going to the Lord. Whether this system ever actually existed historically is debated, but it represented Mencius's vision of equitable distribution of resources and shared responsibility. Beyond material welfare, Mencius believed that good government also required moral education for the people. Schools should be established to teach virtue and proper conduct. The ruler and his officials should set moral examples through their own behavior. When government was truly benevolent, providing both material security and moral guidance, the people would naturally respond with loyalty and contentment. Disorder and rebellion were not caused by the inherent wickedness of the common people, but by the failures of their rulers. This analysis placed enormous responsibility on those in power and provided a framework for criticizing bad government without appearing to be simply rebellious or self-interested. The second major Confucian thinker of the Warring States period was Shunzi, who lived from approximately 310 to 220 before the Common Era. Where Mencius had argued that human nature was fundamentally good, Shunzi took the opposite view, arguing that human nature was fundamentally bad or at least problematic. He believed that people were naturally driven by desires for profit, pleasure, and status, and that if these desires were left unchecked, they would lead to conflict, chaos, and violence. Everyone wanted more wealth, more pleasure, higher status than others. If people simply followed their natural inclinations without restraint, society would descend into a war of all against all, with everyone competing ruthlessly for limited goods. However, Shunzi did not conclude from this pessimistic view of human nature that people were irredeemably evil or that moral improvement was impossible. Rather, he believed that through education, ritual, and social institutions, human nature could be reformed and redirected toward good ends. The artificial, meaning human-created rather than natural, could transform the natural. This was actually the glory of humanity, the capacity to reshape raw nature through culture and civilization. Just as craftsmen transformed raw wood into beautiful furniture, educators and ritualists transformed raw human nature into virtuous character. The process was not easy and required constant effort and vigilance, but it was possible and necessary. Why proper ritual conduct was especially important in Shunzi's philosophy because it imposed order and discipline on unruly passions and desires. Through repeated practice of ritual forms, through habituation to proper conduct, people internalize correct patterns of behavior. Rituals shape desires, channeling them into socially acceptable and productive directions. It established clear hierarchies and boundaries, ensuring that everyone knew their proper place and role. It provided outlets for emotions and energies that might otherwise be destructive. Music, as a complement to ritual, harmonized feelings and created social unity. When people participated in communal musical performances or listened to properly composed music, they experienced shared emotions and developed bonds with others. Shunzi's more realistic view of human nature made him sympathetic to some ideas from the legalist school, which emphasized strict laws and institutions as necessary for social order. While he remained a Confucian in his commitment to moral cultivation and ritual, he believed that good institutions and clear regulations were necessary supplements to moral education. Laws provided external constraints that helped people resist their antisocial impulses while they were developing internal moral discipline. Punishments deterred wrongdoing for those who lacked virtue. Institutions created frameworks that made good behavior easier and bad behavior harder. This more hard-headed approach, this recognition that moral exhortation alone was insufficient and needed to be combined with effective institutions, would later influence some of the imperial dynasties that adopted Confucianism as state ideology, allowing them to combine Confucian ethics with legalist administrative methods. Xunzi also made important contributions to epistemology and philosophy of language. He analyzed how language worked, how names corresponded to realities, and how clear definitions were necessary for clear thinking and communication. He was concerned with the problem of sophistry, of clever arguments that used ambiguous language to confuse people and undermine conventional morality. He insisted on the importance of following proper naming conventions, using words according to their established meanings, rather than creating confusion through rhetorical tricks. This rectification of names, ensuring that words matched realities and that social roles matched their designations, was essential for social order. If a ruler acted tyrannically, he was not truly fulfilling the role of ruler and should not be called by that name. If a father failed in his paternal duties, he was not truly acting as a father should. Proper names reflected proper functions and behaviors, despite the efforts of Mencius, Xunzi, and other Confucian thinkers. The philosophy remained just one school among many during the Warring States period. Taoism attracted those who were disillusioned with conventional society and sought natural spontaneity and individual freedom. Mohism appealed to those who wanted a more egalitarian social order based on universal love and practical utility. Legalism attracted rulers who wanted concrete techniques for increasing state power through administrative efficiency and military strength. The various schools debated and criticized each other, each claiming to have the solution to the crisis of their age. Confucians criticized Mohists for their egalitarianism, which seemed to undermine proper family relationships, and for their utilitarianism, which seemed crass and materialistic. Mohists criticized Confucians for wasteful rituals and for promoting unfair hierarchies. Legalists criticized both for being impractical idealists. Taoists criticized all of them for being too busy interfering with natural processes. In the end, it was the legalist state of Qin that succeeded in conquering all the other states and unifying China under a single ruler in 221 before the Common Era. The state of Qin, located in the western frontier regions, had been considered semi-barbarous by the older central states. But it had ruthlessly implemented legalist policies, establishing strict laws that were applied equally to nobles and commoners, rewarding military merit and agricultural production, and creating a powerful centralized bureaucracy. The Lord Shang, one of the architects of Qin's legalist system, had instituted radical reforms that destroyed the old aristocratic order and created a state focused purely on military and agricultural efficiency. Everything was subordinated to the goal of making the state wealthy and powerful. The first emperor of Qin, Qin Shi Huangdi, was one of the most ambitious and ruthless rulers in Chinese history. Having conquered the other states through overwhelming military force and shrewd diplomacy, he set about creating a truly unified empire. He abolished the feudal system of hereditary regional lords and divided the empire into administrative districts governed by appointed officials who could be transferred or removed at will. He standardized weights, measures, currency, and writing across his newly unified empire, eliminating regional variations that had impeded trade and communication. He built a network of roads radiating out from the capital, allowing troops and officials to move quickly to any part of the empire. He connected and extended defensive walls in the north to create what would eventually become the Great Wall of China, protecting against nomadic invasions. He also undertook a systematic suppression of intellectual diversity and political dissent. In 213, before the Common Era, he ordered the burning of books, targeting especially the classics that Confucians revered and the works of other philosophical schools that questioned or criticized government policies. Private collections of historical and philosophical texts were to be destroyed, with only official copies retained in the imperial library. Books on practical subjects like medicine, agriculture, and divination were exempted, but the texts that formed the basis of classical education were targeted. Scholars who protested this policy or who continued to cite ancient texts in criticism of the government were reportedly buried alive. The traditional number given is 460 scholars, though modern historians question whether the executions were quite this extensive. Nevertheless, it is clear that the first emperor wanted to eliminate alternative sources of authority and create a clean slate, a society organized according to legalist principles of strict law and centralized control, without the distraction of competing ideologies or appeals to ancient precedents. The Qin dynasty was spectacularly successful in its military and organizational achievements, creating the first truly unified Chinese empire and establishing administrative structures that would influence Chinese government for centuries. But it was also spectacularly short-lived, lasting only 15 years as a unified empire. The first emperor died in 210 before the Common Era while on a tour of the eastern provinces. He had been obsessed with finding an elixir of immortality, consulting with magicians and alchemists, but in the end died like any mortal. His death was kept secret for some time as the imperial cortege returned to the capital, with ministers plotting about the succession. His eldest son, the designated heir, was forced to commit suicide, and the younger, weaker son was placed on the throne. The empire quickly collapsed into chaos. The harsh laws and forced labor projects that had built the Great Wall, constructed enormous palaces, and the famous terracotta army to guard the emperor's tomb had created widespread resentment among the population. Peasants were dragged from their farms to work on government projects. Taxes were crushing. Punishments for minor infractions were severe. When the first emperor's strong hand was removed, rebellions broke out across the empire. Former nobles from the conquered states tried to re-establish their kingdoms. Peasant leaders raised armies. The country descended into civil war once again, and the great Qin unification seemed to have been for nothing. After several years of warfare among various contenders, a new dynasty, the Han, emerged victorious in 206 before the Common Era. The founder, Liu Bang, came from humble origins, unlike the hereditary aristocrats who had ruled the various states before Qin unification. He had been a minor local official who joined the rebellion against Qin and through military skill, political acumen and good fortune managed to defeat his rivals and establish a new dynasty. The Han rulers faced a significant challenge. They had inherited a unified empire which they wanted to maintain, avoiding a return to the chaos of the warring states period. But they could not simply continue the Qin dynasty's policies, which had proven so unpopular and which were associated with the recently overthrown regime. They needed a different ideological foundation for their rule, something that would justify imperial authority while also distinguishing their regime from the failed Qin experiment. In the early Han period, the dominant ideology was a form of Taoism that emphasized minimal government interference, light taxation, and allowing society to regulate itself naturally. This hands-off approach was partly a reaction against Qin's intensive state intervention and partly a practical necessity. The new dynasty was weak, the country was exhausted from years of warfare, and the government lacked the administrative capacity to manage everything. So they adopted a policy of recuperation, leaving the people alone to recover from the devastations of the Qin and the Civil War. This approach, associated especially with the reigns of emperors Wen and Jing in the early to mid-2nd century before the Common Era, was relatively successful. The economy recovered, the population grew, and the treasury accumulated surpluses. However, this passive approach to governance proved inadequate for the long-term management of a large, complex empire. As the empire grew stronger and faced new challenges, particularly from the nomadic Xiongnu Confederation to the north, More active policies were needed. The turning point came during the reign of Emperor Wu, who ruled from 141 to 87 before the Common Era. Emperor Wu was an energetic and ambitious ruler who wanted to expand the empire's territory, project its power into Central Asia, and assert Chinese superiority over the surrounding peoples. He launched major military campaigns against the Xiongnu, established new commanderies in what is now Korea and Vietnam, and sent diplomatic missions westward that would eventually lead to the opening of the Silk Road trade routes. All of this required enormous resources and a sophisticated administrative apparatus. Emperor Wu needed educated, capable officials who could implement complex policies, manage tax collection and resource allocation, conduct diplomatic negotiations, and govern far-flung territories. He needed an ideology that would justify imperial authority and inspire loyalty while also constraining the arbitrary use of power and providing guidance for officials. The old legalist ideology was discredited and had proven politically unsustainable. The Taoist hands-off approach was inadequate for an activist government. Mohism had largely faded away, unable to maintain its organizational momentum. But Confucianism offered what the emperor needed. It taught respect for hierarchy and authority, making it useful for legitimizing the emperor's rule and maintaining social order. But it also insisted that rulers had responsibilities to their subjects, and that their authority depended on their moral character and benevolent governance. It emphasized education and merit rather than just birth, allowing for a civil service recruited from educated men of various backgrounds, rather than only from the hereditary aristocracy. And it provided a rich cultural tradition, a common set of texts and values that could help unify the empire's diverse regions and populations under a shared civilizational identity. The scholar most responsible for making Confucianism the official state ideology was Dong Zhongshu, who lived from approximately 179 to 104 before the Common Era. Dong was an extraordinarily learned scholar who had mastered the Confucian classics and who had the philosophical creativity to synthesize Confucian ethics with cosmological ideas drawn from other traditions, particularly the theories of yin and yang and the 5 elements that have been developed by naturalistic philosophers. He argued that heaven, earth, and humanity formed a unified system, all operating according to the same fundamental principles and all intimately connected. The universe was not a mechanical system of material particles, but a living, responsive whole in which different parts influenced each other. The emperor stood at the center of this cosmic order as the son of heaven, the mediating figure between the celestial and terrestrial realms. If the emperor ruled virtuously, maintaining proper rituals and governing benevolently, then harmony would prevail throughout the realm. The seasons would proceed in their proper order, rains would come when needed, harvests would be abundant, and the people would be content. But if the emperor failed in his duties, if he was cruel or neglectful or self-indulgent, then heaven would manifest its displeasure through natural anomalies and disasters. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, eclipses, strange animal behavior. These were not just random natural events, but portents, signs that something was wrong in the moral order. The emperor was responsible for interpreting these signs and correcting whatever had gone wrong, whether through policy changes, ritual observances, or personal moral reform. This cosmological interpretation of Confucianism had profound implications for the theory and practice of government. It gave the emperor tremendous authority as the pivot of cosmic order, the essential link between heaven and earth, whose actions affected everything in the universe. This could be used to justify absolute imperial power and demand unquestioning obedience from subjects. But it also made the emperor accountable for everything that happened in the empire, creating a check on imperial power and a way for officials to criticize the emperor. If crops failed, if floods occurred, if rebellions broke out, if diseases spread, these were not just practical problems requiring technical solutions. They were moral failures of the ruler, signs that heaven was displeased with his conduct. Officials could point to natural or social disorders as evidence of misrule, effectively criticizing the emperor by analyzing objective events, rather than making direct personal attacks that might be seen as disloyal or treasonous. This system of criticism through portent interpretation would become a standard feature of Chinese imperial government. Special officials were designated to observe astronomical phenomena and natural events and report on their significance. The emperor was expected to issue self-critical edicts when disasters occurred, acknowledging his failures and promising reform. Sometimes these were mere formalities, ritualized expressions that changed nothing, but sometimes they led to real policy changes, pardons of prisoners, tax relief, dismissals of corrupt officials. The system created at least some space for political criticism in a regime that otherwise concentrated enormous power in the hands of a single individual. Of course, this check on imperial power was limited and often ineffective. Emperors could ignore portents or interpret them differently, or punish critics who pressed too hard. But the principle that emperors were accountable to heaven and that their legitimacy depended on their moral conduct remained an important part of Chinese political thought. Emperor Wu accepted Dong Zhongshu's proposals and took several concrete steps to establish Confucianism as the official state ideology. In 136 before the Common Era, he established the Imperial Academy, a government institution dedicated to teaching the Confucian classics. 50 students were initially enrolled, though the numbers would grow substantially in later years. These students studied the 5 classics under specialized teachers, each classic having its own professorship. The classics that Confucius had taught and that had been targeted for destruction by the Qin dynasty were now declared mandatory subjects of study for anyone seeking government office. Mastery of these texts became the primary qualification for entering imperial service. An examination system was created to select officials based on their knowledge of Confucian texts and their ability to apply Confucian principles to practical problems of governance. Local officials were ordered to recommend men of talent and virtue for government service. These recommended candidates would be tested on their knowledge of the classics and on their analytical and writing abilities. Those who performed well would receive appointments, often starting in junior positions and advancing through merit. This system would be refined and expanded over subsequent centuries, eventually becoming the famous civil service examination system that would select Chinese officials for nearly 2,000 years until its abolition in the early 20th century. The adoption of Confucianism by the Han Dynasty marked the beginning of its transformation into much more than just a philosophical school. It became the defining ideology of Chinese civilization, shaping government institutions, educational practices, family structures, and social relationships. The Confucian emphasis on education meant that literacy and learning were highly valued throughout Chinese society, not just among the elite. The ideal of the scholar official, the person who combined moral cultivation with practical administrative skill, became the model for social advancement and public service. Families invested heavily in educating sons, hoping they might pass the examinations and bring honor and resources to the family. The Confucian focus on family relationships meant that filial piety, respect for elders, and ancestor veneration became absolutely central to Chinese culture. The family was seen as the foundation of all social order, and proper family relationships were considered essential training for all other social roles. The Confucian stress on ritual and propriety shaped everything from court ceremonies to everyday etiquette. Elaborate protocols governed interactions between people of different ranks and relationships. There were proper ways to greet superiors and inferiors, to host guests, to conduct weddings and funerals, to celebrate holidays. These rituals reinforced social hierarchies but also created predictability and stability. Everyone knew what to expect, what was expected of them, reducing anxiety and conflict. The rituals also created beauty and meaning, transforming ordinary interactions into significant events, connecting individuals to larger traditions and communities. Confucianism became so deeply embedded in Chinese society that it was simply taken for granted, like the air people breathed. It was not just a set of ideas one could choose to accept or reject, but the basic framework of Chinese civilization itself. Over the centuries following the Han Dynasty, Confucianism continued to evolve and develop while remaining rooted in the teachings of the master. Different emphases emerged in different periods and regions. During the political fragmentation that followed the collapse of the Han Dynasty in the early 3rd century of the Common Era, Buddhism entered China from India and gained enormous influence. Buddhist monasteries spread across the country, Buddhist texts were translated into Chinese, and Buddhist philosophy challenged many Confucian assumptions. Buddhism offered elaborate metaphysical systems explaining the nature of reality, detailed practices of meditation and spiritual cultivation, and the promise of liberation from suffering through enlightenment or rebirth in pure lands. These were dimensions that traditional Confucianism had not developed extensively, and many educated Chinese found Buddhist ideas and practices attractive. During the Tang and Song dynasties, from the 7th to the 13th centuries of the Common Era, a revival of Confucian philosophy occurred in response to the challenge posed by Buddhism. Confucian scholars felt that their tradition needed a more developed metaphysical and spiritual dimension to compete with Buddhist philosophy's sophistication. They needed to show that Confucianism could address the ultimate questions about reality, the cosmos, and human nature that Buddhism addressed so systematically. The result was Neo-Confucianism, a sophisticated philosophical movement that incorporated metaphysical speculation about the nature of reality while remaining committed to Confucian ethics and social thought. The greatest of the Neo-Confucian philosophers was Zhu Xi, who lived from 1130 to 1200 in the Common Era during the Southern Song dynasty. Zhu Xi synthesized centuries of Neo-Confucian development into a comprehensive philosophical system that would become orthodox doctrine for centuries. He systematized Confucian philosophy, identifying 4 key texts as the essential core of Confucian learning. These were the Analects, the Mencius, the Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean, collectively known as the 4 books. While previous scholars had studied these texts, Zhu Xi elevated them to a status equal to or even above the 5 classics, arguing that they contained the essential teachings more directly and accessibly. He wrote extensive commentaries on these texts, interpreting them in light of Neo-Confucian metaphysics, and his interpretations became the standard for the civil service examinations, the baseline understanding that all educated Chinese had to master. Zhu Xi also developed a complex philosophy of principle and material force, 2 fundamental aspects of reality. Li, meaning principle or pattern, was the rational structure or organizing pattern inherent in all things. Everything and every kind of thing had its Li, the essential nature that made it what it was. Qi, meaning material force or psychophysical energy, was the dynamic substance that composed all concrete things. Li and Qi were inseparable in actual existence, but could be distinguished analytically. Pure Li existed before and beyond the physical universe, a realm of perfect patterns and forms. When Li combined with Qi, concrete things came into being, each embodying the principles appropriate to its nature, but doing so with varying degrees of clarity and perfection depending on the purity of the Qi involved. Human beings possess the same fundamental Li as everyone else, the essential human nature that Mencius had identified as good. But this nature was obscured or distorted by the Qi each person inherited, which varied in clarity and purity. Some people had clear Qi that allowed their innate moral nature to manifest easily. Others had turbid Qi that obscured their true nature and made moral cultivation difficult. But through sustained effort in study, self-examination and practice, anyone could clarify their Qi and allow their true nature to shine through. This process of moral cultivation involved both intellectual understanding and practical application, both investigating the principles inherent in things and regulating one's own conduct according to those principles. Zhu Xi placed great emphasis on the investigation of things and the extension of knowledge, quoting a passage from the Great Learning. He interpreted this to mean that students should carefully study the principles manifest in various things and affairs, gradually building up comprehensive understanding. Through reading classical texts, observing natural phenomena, reflecting on human relationships, and analyzing ethical situations, students would come to grasp the underlying principles that governed reality. This accumulated understanding would suddenly crystallize into thorough comprehension, a breakthrough moment when all the scattered insights connected into a unified vision of the way. Zhu Xi compared this to building up kindling for a fire. When enough material had been gathered and properly arranged, a single spark would set it all ablaze. This emphasis on study and intellectual understanding balanced Confucianism's practical and ethical focus. Moral cultivation was not just a matter of following rules or performing rituals, but required deep understanding of why those rules and rituals made sense, how they manifested underlying principles. At the same time, Zhu Xi insisted that study was not enough. Understanding had to be put into practice through careful regulation of conduct, through discipline of emotions and desires, through constant vigilance against moral backsliding. The unity of knowledge and action, the insistence that true knowledge inevitably manifested in appropriate behavior, became a central theme of Neo-Confucian philosophy. If someone claimed to understand but did not act accordingly, their understanding was merely superficial, intellectual assent rather than genuine wisdom. Throughout these later developments, the figure of Confucius himself remained central to the tradition. He was not just the founder of a school of thought, but a cultural hero, a symbol of wisdom and virtue, almost a sacred figure. Temples were erected in his honor throughout China and in neighboring countries influenced by Chinese culture. Every county seat had a Confucian temple where regular ceremonies were performed to pay respect to the master and to the great Confucian scholars of later generations whose tablets were also honored. These ceremonies involved elaborate rituals with music and dance, offerings of food and wine, formal prostrations, and the reading of classical texts. They were presided over by local officials and scholars, and they reinforced Confucian values while also legitimizing the authority of those who performed them. Confucius was awarded increasingly grand posthumous titles by successive dynasties. He was called ultimate sage and first teacher. He was granted noble ranks and imperial titles. Some popular religious movements went further, deifying him and treating him as a divine being with supernatural powers who could answer prayers and provide protection. While elite Confucian scholars typically resisted such deification, insisting that Confucius was a human sage, not a god, the popular veneration reflected the enormous cultural impact he had achieved. His descendants were granted special privileges by various dynasties. The Kong family maintained the temple and tomb complex in Khufu for centuries, and the family head held an hereditary noble title. This practice continued all the way to the 20th century, with the last sacrificial official to Confucius, Kong Qiu, serving until the Communist Revolution. Schools and academies throughout East Asia bore Confucius's name and his image. Students would bow before his portrait or tablet before beginning their studies, invoking his spirit as a kind of patron saint of learning. The yearly cycle included ritual observances honoring Confucius's birthday, which became an important occasion for reflection on education and culture. In these various ways, Confucius remained a living presence in Chinese and East Asian culture, not just a historical figure studied in texts, but an ongoing source of inspiration and guidance. Yet despite this tremendous veneration, despite being elevated to almost divine status, Confucius himself remained surprisingly human in the texts that recorded his life and teachings. Unlike religious founders who performed miracles, received divine revelations, or claimed supernatural knowledge, Confucius appears in the Analects and other sources as someone struggling with the same problems and questions as his students and readers. He admits uncertainty, acknowledges his own failures, and continues learning throughout his life. When asked if he was a sage, he denied it, saying he simply loved learning and was tireless in teaching others. When asked about death and spirits, He said he did not yet understand life and how to serve people, so how could he understand death or how to serve spirits? This focus on the human world, on practical ethics and real relationships, remained characteristic of Confucianism even as it developed elaborate metaphysical dimensions. Confucius finds joy in simple pleasures, music and poetry, good conversation, the company of devoted students. He grieves when he loses people he loves, showing genuine human emotion rather than detached philosophical calm. He gets frustrated when his ideas are not understood or accepted, showing passionate commitment rather than indifferent resignation. This human quality makes Confucius accessible and relatable, even across vast distances of time and culture. He is a model of virtue that seems achievable rather than impossibly remote, someone whose struggles and successes resonate with ordinary human experience. This accessibility has been crucial for Confucianism's enduring appeal, allowing each generation to find in Confucius a guide who seems relevant to their particular circumstances. The influence of Confucius and Confucianism extended far beyond China proper to shape the entire East Asian cultural sphere. As Chinese civilization spread and interacted with neighboring regions through trade, diplomacy, military campaigns, and cultural exchange, Confucian ideas traveled with it. Korea adopted Confucianism as a central element of its culture over many centuries, but particularly during the Joseon dynasty, which lasted from 1392 to 1910. The Joseon dynasty was founded by scholars and officials who were deeply committed to Confucian principles and who wanted to create an ideal Confucian state. They implemented thorough reforms of government, education, and society based on Confucian models. Korean Neo-Confucianism developed its own distinctive characteristics, and some scholars argued that Korea preserved Confucian values more faithfully than China itself, particularly as China came under non-Chinese rule during the Mongol Yuan dynasty and the Manchu Qing dynasty. Korean scholars engaged deeply with Chinese Confucian texts and debates while also developing their own interpretations and emphases. Japan also absorbed significant Confucian influence, though it adapted these ideas to fit its own social structure and values, which differed in important ways from Chinese patterns. During the Tokugawa period from the early 17th to the mid-19th century, Neo-Confucianism became the official ideology of the ruling shogunate. Japanese scholars studied Chinese texts and wrote commentaries in classical Chinese. They emphasized Confucian values of loyalty, duty, and hierarchy, though they reconfigured these within Japan's distinctive feudal system. The Japanese emphasis on loyalty to one's lord became even more absolute than in China, reflecting Japan's more rigidly hierarchical social structure. Confucian values also influenced Japanese aesthetics, education, and business culture in ways that continue to be visible today. Vietnam, which was directly ruled by China for extended periods and which remained heavily influenced by Chinese culture even when independent, made Confucianism central to its educational and governmental systems. Vietnamese civil service examinations were modeled closely on the Chinese system. Vietnamese scholars wrote in classical Chinese and studied the same Confucian texts as their Chinese counterparts. Vietnam developed its own tradition of Confucian scholarship and produced notable Confucian thinkers who contributed to broader East Asian intellectual discussions. The influence of Confucianism in Vietnam was so profound that Vietnamese social structures, family relationships, and values remained strongly Confucian even after Vietnam gained independence from Chinese rule and developed its own distinct national identity. The modern period brought unprecedented challenges to Confucianism. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as China confronted Western imperialism, military defeats, and economic exploitation, many Chinese intellectuals blamed Confucianism for China's weakness and backwardness. They argued that Confucian values of hierarchy and tradition had made China conservative and unable to adapt to modern conditions. The emphasis on classics and traditional learning had supposedly prevented the development of modern science and technology. The focus on maintaining social harmony had supposedly stifled individual creativity and innovation. The stress on hierarchy and authority had supposedly made Chinese people passive and unable to resist oppression. Critics called for completely abandoning Confucianism and embracing Western ideas of science, democracy, individual rights, and social revolution. The May 4th movement of 1919, named for student protests in Beijing against the Treaty of Versailles, which had transferred German concessions in China to Japan rather than returning them to Chinese control, became a watershed moment for Chinese intellectuals. Many May 4th intellectuals called for a complete cultural revolution, rejecting traditional Chinese culture as feudal and backward. Confucianism was seen as the embodiment of everything wrong with old China: authoritarian, patriarchal, superstitious, and resistant to change. Prominent intellectuals like Kong Qiu and Hu Shi called for replacing Confucian values with Western-style democracy and science. Others, like Lu Xun, wrote devastating critiques of traditional culture, portraying it as cannibalistic and soul-destroying. The establishment of the Chinese Republic in 1911 had already ended the imperial system that had been closely linked with Confucianism. The civil service examinations based on Confucian classics were abolished in 1905, and Confucian texts were no longer mandatory subjects in schools. The Communist Revolution of 1949 brought an even more severe rejection of Confucianism. The Communist Party, guided by Marxist-Leninist ideology adapted to Chinese conditions by Mao Zedong, saw Confucian ideas of hierarchy and tradition as feudal remnants that had to be eliminated to build a socialist society. Class struggle, revolution, and the elimination of old ideas were the watchwords. During the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s, Red Guards attacked Confucian temples, destroying statues, burning texts, and desecrating sacred sites. The Kong family cemetery and temple in Khufu, which had been maintained for over 2,000 years, suffered significant damage. Confucius himself was denounced as a representative of the exploiting classes, a defender of slavery and feudalism. Campaigns against Confucianism sought to eradicate what was called feudal thinking from Chinese society. Traditional family structures were attacked as oppressive, traditional authority patterns were overturned, and traditional cultural practices were banned as superstitious and backward. However, Confucianism proved remarkably resilient. Even when officially rejected and violently suppressed, Confucian values continued to shape Chinese society at a deep level. The emphasis on education, family loyalty, respect for learning, and social harmony remained powerful forces in Chinese culture, even under communist rule. As the initial revolutionary fervor subsided and China began its economic reforms in the 1980s, interest in traditional culture gradually revived. In recent decades, there has been a significant revival of interest in Confucianism, both in China and internationally. The Chinese government, despite its communist ideology, has begun to promote certain Confucian values as part of Chinese national identity and soft power. Confucius institutes have been established around the world to teach Chinese language and culture, and to promote a positive image of China. These institutes, though controversial in some countries, due to concerns about Chinese government influence, have spread Confucian ideas and Chinese culture globally. Scholars in China and elsewhere have explored how Confucian ideas might be adapted to address modern problems of ethics, governance, and social organization. Some argue that Confucian emphasis on community and social harmony provides an alternative to Western individualism, one that might be better suited to addressing contemporary challenges like environmental degradation and social fragmentation. Others suggest that Confucian ideas about moral leadership and virtuous government properly updated could contribute to better governance in modern states. There are debates about whether Confucianism can be reconciled with democratic values or whether it is fundamentally hierarchical and authoritarian. The question of whether Confucianism is compatible with modern values like democracy, human rights, and gender equality remains actively contested. Critics point to Confucianism's emphasis on hierarchy and its subordination of individuals to families and families to the state, its patriarchal assumptions about gender roles and family structure. They argue that these features are fundamentally incompatible with democratic principles of equality individual rights, and popular sovereignty. The traditional Confucian family structure placed women in subordinate positions, denied them independent identity, and restricted their opportunities. The political philosophy justified autocratic rule and made resistance to authority difficult. The emphasis on conformity and social harmony discouraged dissent and individual expression. Defenders of Confucianism respond in various ways. Some argue that Confucianism's core values of benevolent government, moral leadership, and concern for people's welfare can support democratic institutions even if they were developed in different political contexts. The idea that rulers must be accountable to higher moral standards and must govern for the people's benefit, not their own advantage, can be translated into democratic accountability through elections and rule of law. The emphasis on education and self-cultivation can support an informed, engaged citizenry capable of democratic participation. The stress on civil service based on merit rather than birth anticipated modern meritocracy and professional bureaucracy. Moreover, defenders argue that Confucianism has always been more diverse and flexible than critics acknowledge. Different thinkers within the tradition have emphasized different aspects and drawn different conclusions. It is possible to develop more egalitarian and liberal interpretations of Confucian principles while remaining true to the tradition's core insights. The debate continues and will likely continue for years to come, reflecting the ongoing relevance of questions that Confucius first raised over 2,500 years ago. What seems clear is that Confucius's influence has been extraordinary by any measure. He took the wisdom of ancient texts and rituals, materials that might have been lost or remained the preserve of a small elite, and transformed them into a living philosophy that could guide human conduct. He made education accessible and argued that moral character mattered more than birth or wealth, democratizing what had been an aristocratic privilege. He taught that government should serve the people and that rulers should be held to high ethical standards, establishing principles that challenged arbitrary power. He emphasized the importance of family relationships and social harmony, creating frameworks that shape societies for millennia. He insisted that ordinary human life, properly conducted with attention to ethics and ritual, could be meaningful and virtuous without requiring supernatural intervention, world-renouncing asceticism, or escape from social responsibilities. The small community of disciples that gathered around Confucius in the state of Lu, a group of wandering students following an unsuccessful teacher, grew into one of the most influential intellectual traditions in human history. The frustrated government official who died believing he had failed in his mission became one of the most revered figures in East Asian civilization. The fragmentary conversations recorded in the Analects became texts studied by hundreds of millions of students over centuries, memorized, analyzed, and applied to countless situations. The simple principle that one should not impose on others what one would not choose for oneself, the so-called golden rule that Confucius articulated when asked for a single word that could guide conduct for life, became known worldwide and influenced ethical thinking across cultures. Today, more than 2 millennia after his death, Confucius remains a living presence in East Asian culture and an increasingly important figure in global philosophical discussions. His emphasis on moral cultivation, proper conduct, family values, and benevolent government continues to resonate with people seeking alternatives to purely materialistic or individualistic worldviews. His recognition that social harmony depends on individual virtue and that education can transform character seems as relevant now as it was in his own chaotic age. In an era of renewed concern about community breakdown, political dysfunction, and moral crisis, Confucian insights about the importance of ritual, the cultivation of virtue, the responsibilities of leadership, and the connections between personal ethics and social order speak to contemporary concerns. The life of Confucius is a testament to the power of ideas and the importance of teaching. He held no great political power, commanded no armies, founded no empire. He never achieved the official recognition and authority he sought during his lifetime, yet through the force of his moral vision and the devotion of his students, he shaped the civilization of East Asia more profoundly than most emperors and generals. He demonstrated that a single teacher, working with a small group of dedicated disciples, preserving and transmitting ancient wisdom while adapting it to new circumstances, could plant seeds that would grow into a mighty tradition spanning continents and centuries. His influence reminds us that cultural and intellectual legacies can outlast political power and military conquest, that ideas can transform societies more durably than force. The birth of Confucianism was not a single moment but a gradual process that unfolded over many generations. It began with Confucius's own teaching and example, his daily interactions with students, his efforts to understand and transmit ancient wisdom. It continued with the disciples who recorded his words and preserved his memory, who scattered across China carrying his teachings to new audiences. It developed through the work of later philosophers like Mencius and Sun Tzu, who elaborated and debated Confucian principles, adapting them to changing circumstances. It achieved institutional form when the Han Dynasty adopted it as state ideology and created educational and examination systems based on Confucian texts. It evolved through centuries of commentary and interpretation, through the creative synthesis of Neo-Confucianism, through transmission to neighboring cultures where it took on new forms. It survived periods of rejection and suppression, proving resilient enough to re-emerge repeatedly. And it continues today, still debated, still studied, still shaping how millions of people think about ethics, society, and human flourishing. This is the story of how one man's vision of moral order and human potential, rooted in study of ancient texts and reflection on human nature, became a living tradition that has influenced human civilization for over 2,000 years. It is the story of how Confucius, the wandering teacher who never found the enlightened ruler he sought, succeeded beyond what he could have imagined in educating countless generations after him. It is the story of how philosophical ideas, carefully preserved and thoughtfully adapted, can transcend their original context to speak to universal human concerns. It is the story of Confucius and the birth of Confucianism, a tradition that began in the small state of Lu in the spring and autumn period, but that has become part of humanity's shared wisdom, a resource for anyone seeking to understand how to live well, how to relate faithfully to others, and how to create societies that nurture human flourishing.